Hi guys. So we are. Ooh, why is my face here? I'm gonna take my face off. I really don't need that. Uh, Hide video panel. Stop video. There we go. You don't need my face. It's fine. So we're gonna just. This should not take you long at all, but I really wanted to make sure I did it well and I didn't rush through it at the end of class. All right. So remember, what you're gonna do is you're gonna listen to this. You're going to write it in your notes, and then at the start of class on Friday, I'm going to instruct the guest teacher that I want you to turn it into them, so I know that it was turned into the right place. So you won't turn it into the bin, you'll turn it into the guest teacher at the start of class on Friday, okay? So remember, we said Potsdam is our second conference. It happens after VE Day, Victory in Europe, and now they need to decide what to do with Japan. And we said that this is possibly really the beginning of the Cold War, because really tensions start to boil between the USSR and the United States, because sure, the United States is mad at Russia because they signed that non-aggression pact with Germany and they don't feel like Russia should be getting perks, but Russia wants perks. But also there's a little bit contention over the atomic bomb, because theoretically, through historical accounts, this is when the United States sent out feelers on the atomic bomb. So I'll talk about the next two bullet points in a sec, but let's look at this source on the next slide, okay? So these are two different conversations. The first one's with Harry Truman. Remember, this is the new US President of the United States. US President of the United States is redundant. He's a new US President. He took over after FDR when FDR died in office. So according to Truman, and at this meeting, he said, on July 24th, I casually mentioned to Stalin that we had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The Russian premier, that's Stalin, it basically means like president, prime minister. Stalin, the Russian premier, showed no special interest. All he said was he was glad to hear it and hoped we would make good use of it against the Japanese. Okay? So, I mean, we can normally, I would ask you these questions, but this is a flipped classroom. All right. So, but we can kind of get the vibe here that Truman believes that he, hint, hint, winked, wink, heavy enough that he's like, they knew it was the atomic bomb and they could care less. Now, the conversation, though, according to a Soviet general, went a little bit differently. All right. But keep in mind, this recollection of the Soviet perspective isn't from Stalin, who, I mean, the conversation was between Stalin and Truman. So this is coming secondhand. Someone was there, but it's still, he's not the person who said it. He overheard it, okay? Truman informed Stalin that the United States now possessed a bomb of exceptional power, without, however, naming it the atomic bomb. It was clear already that the US government intended to use the atomic weapon for the purpose of achieving its imperialist goals from a position of strength in the Cold War. So, clearly not as chill with it in this source. But here's what we can prove. Both of these sources agree with the fact. So this is where we're starting to get complexity and sourcing points. Both of these documents corroborate, agree, or prove that the United States did not directly name it the atomic bomb. And in the Soviet source, clearly that's a big source of soreness here. They're like, fine, we were okay with a bomb of exceptional power, but not an atomic bomb. Where the United States was kind of like, we didn't say it, but they knew we meant the atomic bomb and they didn't care. They didn't show any caring about it. All right. So take that as you will. But another important point to make here, especially coming from the fact that this is from a Soviet general, and the fact that he is saying it was clear already that the US government intended to use the atomic weapon for the purpose of achieving its imperialist goals. Basically, this guy is almost analyzing the conversation and interpreting it. And he is saying that specifically the United States used the atomic bomb to intimidate Russia for a position of strength in the Cold War. But when Potsdam was going on, the Cold War really hadn't started, or it was just about to start. So clearly, the Soviet general, whether the United States did or didn't use it to scare Russia, which is your point of view here and how we interpret the historical sources, but, sorry, afternoon bell. But clearly this guy is making this commentary in the midst of the Cold War. So we would want to tread carefully with this source because he is particularly using the conversation to try to make a point that the United States is imperialistic, that they're using atomic bombs for power, and he is purposefully, I mean, whether you not believe that's why the atomic bomb was used, he is purposely trying to prove that the United States, with this conversation, had a particular aim that they disagree with, okay? So we analyzed those sources doing a little bit of complexity. How do these two sources corroborate the fact that the United States didn't name it as the atomic bomb? And we did a little bit of historical situation and point of view with the Soviet perspective and purpose too, really. So regardless, just days after the meeting, the United States does drop the two bombs in August. August 6th and 9th, we've got Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, all right? And they drop those bombs on Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are two Japanese cities. And regardless, we do get VJ Day, Victory in Japan, soon after in September. But the last thing that we really need to do is looking at the overall outcomes of World War II, some of which have to do with the Cold War, some of them are outside the Cold War. So first off, European powers' loss of empires and colonies. You could also write at number 1, decolonization. After World War II, they finally start to actually get rid of those colonies and give them independence like they've been promising since World War I. Because think about it, they've been fighting, or they've been using propaganda to say that there's this huge ideological battle against Hitler and the Axis powers, and the Axis powers take away liberty and freedom, etc., etc. I mean, we see the Holocaust and the Nanking massacre, all right? There's certainly mass atrocities. And even the allies, the Western allies, don't like their ally of Stalin saying he may be an allied power, but it's soon discovered that Stalin had tons of atrocities against his own people. So, I mean, especially these countries like Britain and France with tons of colonies, they're over here saying the Axis powers are terrible and Stalin is terrible. It's kind of hypocritical for them to continue to keep their colonies, okay? And on a practical note as well, by this point, there's been so many nationalistic type rebellions, which we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to do that decolonization Twitter project after we look at the Holocaust. All right. It's just too expensive to keep colonies. They just don't have the ability to keep these colonies. They're not worth it anymore. It's too much money. So Europe starts to give up their colonies after World War II. All right, their empire shrinks. They're an empire no more. They're just a nation state because they get rid of those colonies. Or what were the name of those pseudo colonies after World War I that were, quote, getting ready for independence that the League of Nations were administering? Mandates. All right, that includes also giving mandates their independence. Number 2 is the Cold War, all right? Another outcome of World War II is the Cold War. We get the establishment of two major powers in the world and the tension between them being the Cold War. And those two major powers are the United States and the USSR. And part of this Cold War and these tension between is they effectively divide Europe. So I would maybe too, as I'm about to talk about this, maybe check the notes that you took on what the Iron Curtain was on your page. I think it was 51. 41, whatever you guys, the assignment you guys did in class. The Iron Curtain is very much an ideological wall. It's this idea of a line between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Eastern Europe being the USSR and its, quote, satellite states, the Eastern Bloc, these communist states. And then, quote, unquote, Western Europe, all right, non-communist Europe. So it's this idea of this Iron Curtain, this idea of all of these nations that have fallen to communism. Now, and maybe you wrote this, there were very real walls or guards or provisions along the borders of communist and non-communist states. So the Iron Curtain, meaning this sort of line between Eastern and Western Europe, does have really true defensive systems. But when we use the Iron Curtain, sure, it really is though sort of talking about the ideological division between East and Western Europe and non-communist and communist Europe. Okay. Also, these two major powers start to do things like what we call the Marshall Plan. Particularly the United States issues the Marshall Plan. And the United States says the only reason nation states are falling into communism is because they're in the Soviet Union, and the power of the Soviet Union is because they're in economic distress from World War II. So if we help them get out of their economic distress, they would never choose communism. So the United States offers the Marshall Plan, where they give economic aid to a lot of states in Western Europe, particularly states on the border of the Iron Curtain, to help incentivize them not falling to the USSR's influence in communism. And both sides, the USSR and the USA, form defensive treaties. You've got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is done by Western Europe and the United States and North America, and the Warsaw Pact, which is basically a defensive pact between the USSR and its satellite states, places like Ukraine and Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. And as we said, remember the Yalta Conference, they decided they wanted the Nuremberg trials. Well, the outcome of the World War II is that they do hold the war crimes trials, which is the Nuremberg trials. And it's not just a one-shot thing. This takes years to do because it takes years to apprehend fleeing Nazi criminals or other war criminals that weren't just under Germany. And the other thing is the establishment of the United Nations. Remember, the United Nations replaced which peacekeeping body? Think about it. World War I created what peacekeeping body? The League of Nations. The United Nations replaced the League of Nations because clearly the League of Nations was a failure at keeping world peace because World War II happened. So they established the United Nations, which is very similar. It's just constructed differently, and we'll talk more about the formation of the United Nations later. But the United Nations is similar in its aims, where it wants to keep world peace, but it's also very much a humanitarian aid group. They want to give humanitarian aid to places in need. And so one thing the United Nations comes up with is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What should, in this global world, every citizen be entitled to? Because somewhere there should be some nation that helps ensure certain rights for people around the world. And it is the duty of nations with political clout, with economic power, to help out other nations or people who are being abused by their own governments or other governments, etc. So the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that there should be a certain standard of living, not necessarily economic standard of living, but basic human decency guaranteed for all people around the globe. Okay? So those are the end of your notes. So make sure you turn in this worksheet to the what do I call that? Guest teacher. I mean, heck, if you want to show it to me Thursday, like in between passing period really quick or during homeroom, I don't care. You can do that too. All right. And then just glue it in your notebook. All right. But make sure if you don't show it to me Thursday on your own time, if you want to make sure, turn it into the guest teacher at the start of block 1 on Friday. Okay, bye.